Hey, smile! In this video, I'm gonna teach you everything you need to know about cameras to use those things properly inside of Blender. The reason I'm making this video is because you need to know how do cameras work in the real world to create a photorealistic rendering. Because if you don't know how to properly take photos, how do you think you would be able to create a photorealistic thing? In the first part, I will teach you the basics about cameras and photography. And in the second part, I will teach you how to use this knowledge inside of Blender. So we're gonna take a look in my computer, okay? So photography in general is divided in three pillars. These pillars of photography are put in a triangle. In this triangle, we have the ISO, the shutter speed, and the f-stop. The ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor of the camera to the light. A higher ISO will bring more light inside of your sensor. We can compare the ISO of the camera to the samples inside of Blender. Because if you think about it, as much time you allow it to render, more Blender will be able to capture more light and then get less noisy. But it's not exactly the same thing, but those things are the things that deal with noisy images. The second thing in cameras is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is the time that the camera will take to closer the shutter and to capture the image. A higher shutter speed will get less light because it will close too fast to allow the light to enter in the sensor of the camera. But as higher your shutter speed is, more definition you will have if you are taking a picture or filming an animated object or an object in movement. A lower shutter speed will allow more light to enter on your camera, but at the same time will get a lot of motion blur. So if any object on your scene is in movement, the motion blur will appear depending on the shutter speed of your camera. Just to show two examples where shutter speeds are used in different ways, you can think about a photography of a waterfall, for example. It's nicer to take a picture of a waterfall if the shutter speed is lower because the motion blur will sell the idea of the movement of the water. In the other hand, for example, if you are trying to take a picture of your puppy, it's better to have a higher shutter speed because this will froze the movement of your puppy and it will not look blurry. You will be able to see your puppy freezing in time, which is much more nicer when you are trying to capture the movement of your little friend. The last thing on this triangle is the f-stop. The f-stop will tell you how much the blades of your lens are open or closed during your shot. This will affect a lot how the shot looks. Because if you have something too close, you will get a crisp image from a subject in front of your camera, but everything behind will be blurry. So this can be really useful to take a picture of something or to film something and to drive the attention to that thing, because that thing will be crisp and sharp on your shot and everything else will be blurry. It is a really nice tool to bring emphasis to your shot. In the other hand, if you are trying to render or photograph something like a landscape and you want to have everything in focus, a lower f-stop or something more open will be better to keep everything in focus. But you need to remember something. If the blades of the lens are more open, more light will enter, and this will totally affect the other things in your photography triangle. So come with me in my computer and I will show you how does this work inside of Blender. The first one we're gonna talk about is the ISO. And I know this is not a completely fair comparison, but this is the closer thing we have inside of Blender. Come here to the sampling viewport and reduce the amount of samples we have in our scene. This is really similar to a higher ISO, to my noise, but not that similar actually, because the noise in the ISO will not destroy the image like a low sample account. But those two things are related to noise on your images, so let's put those things in the same box just because the final result is dealing with noise. But remember, they are not the same thing, they are not comparable. I will keep my sample in 2000 and let's move on. The second thing we're gonna talk about here is the shutter speed. You can see that I have a Susan the monkey here on my scene. If you come out the rendering, you can see that I have a simple animation of this monkey falling. And now, by coming here to the rendering options, you can see this option here called motion blur. Motion blur is related to the shutter speed. Here, the default number for shutter speed in Blender is 0.5. So let's take a look and see how a 0 shutter speed will look. As you can see, the 0 shutter speed will basically make the monkey look like an object floating on top of the floor. We will never understand that this is an object falling from the sky. So let's increase this number. Now I will increase the shutter speed to 0.5. Let's render it again. Now you can see that we have a little bit of a motion blur. Now this object is not completely on focus. It looks like something that is falling, but the effect is not getting really good. I'm not sure that this monkey is falling from the sky because the direction of the blur is not really clear. So let's increase this more to see how it will look. Here in the shutter speed, I will change this number to 3. Now let's render it again. Now you can see that the movement looks really extreme. This is basically the same feeling we get from those anime lines that deliver the idea of movement. But let me show this in a real project so you can understand how you can use it to enhance your images. In this animation, I use the shutter speed to deliver the feeling of movement in this car. If this car is passing by myself without a motion blur, it will feel really weird. But the motion blur does not need to be something extreme. You can see in this rendering here that we have a lot of falling leaves on the sky. The motion blur here is turned on. But the motion blur is not so extreme. It's just enough to bring a little bit of sauce to the movement of those leaves. Now let's talk about the f-stops of the focal length. To see this option in Blender, you need to select your camera. Now you need to come here to the properties, click in the camera object data properties, and here you will see this option here called depth of field. If you turn off this option, you will see that inside of Blender, in Cycles and in Eevee as well, everything will be in the same focus. So you can see that this bench here, a perfect clear focus in the end of the scene, also have the same amount of focus. This is not realistic at all, so we need to turn on this option to make it look more realistic. By turning on the depth of field, we're gonna have an option to change the distance of the depth of field. Lower distance will bring the focus too close to the camera. A higher distance will increase the focus in that specific distance. Imagine someone with myopia, a bad eyesight. This is basically the same effect. But it's really hard to get the focus by changing the distance. So the best way to do that is by click here in this eyedropper and set the focus to a specific object on your scene. In this case, I will focus on my monkey, and you will see that now I have the f-stop option available to me. If I put it on 0, everything will become just a white paper. If I increase it just a little bit, now you can see that we have a really interesting tool to bring emphasis, because my monkey is in focus and everything else is blurry. If I put it on 1.8, you can see more of the scene, but my monkey is totally on focus and everything else is now blurry. If you want to make everything more in focus, you can increase this number to 8. Now the entire scene is in focus, but the main focus is the monkey. You can see that the monkey is in focus, is totally sharp, but not everything else is sharp. You can see that the statue and those leaves here are not totally crystal clear. The max number I usually use on the f-stop is 16. In all of my exterior renderings that I need to have everything in focus, I will always turn on the depth of field and put my f-stops in 16. Because a bit of blurriness on your image is realistic. Cameras will do that all the time. And then, if you want to change the focus of your image, you can just press here the X and select other object to be your focus. Now, my statue is the focus. The same rule applies to Cycles and Eve, okay? Finally, we're gonna talk about exposure. So the three aspects of photography that I just talked about were the exposure triangle. We were always talking about the amount of light those pieces in the camera will allow to enter to the sensor and deliver a final image. But here in Blender, we don't have that. We have this option here called color management, where we can change the exposure of our scene. By default, this is the exposure of Blender, just 0. You can see that's really dark. And you can see that I can increase the exposure until I see my scene. But the correct way to deal with that is by come here to the view transform and change it to false color. Here you can see a spectrum. The bluish tones will be the things that are in low exposure, so they are darker. Things with yellow head or white colors will be things that are in higher exposure or clipping to the white. You can see that now we are losing information. This is the clipping, the overexposure of your scene. So putting it on false color and finding a sweet spot. Some of the spots are a little bit reddish, but not everything will bring something more interesting to your eyes. And then you can just change the look to high contrast or even very high contrast to really bring something more interesting to your scene. In this case, I put my exposure in 3.5 and I call it a day because, in my opinion, it was looking really good. Now that you know how to use cameras in the real world and inside of Blender, you will be able to develop much better renderings and animations on the 3D software. And this will totally change your Archviz career. But do you know exactly what is Archviz? So click in this video here and I will teach you a little bit more about what is Archviz, and I'm totally sure that I will surprise you.